All right, let's go ahead and move on and talk about this 1 million rising. This is actually probably the most important development I've seen in a while. And the latest push here from Indivisible, which is the country's largest protest organizing group. They also run No Kings and several other things you've heard before. They've launched a training program they want to train 1 million organizers who will be holding in-person meetings to recruit and organize additional activists over the next 2 weeks. It starts today and runs through, I think, the 12th of August or so. Each of these organizers is being trained and asked to host 2 meetings, like at their home or at a community center, but local to where they live. They're recruiting their neighbors and friends, family, like locals. The first meeting is designed to orient these new recruits to resistance strategies like strategic non-cooperation, and I will get to that in just a second. And then they're holding a second meeting, again, at some point in the next 2 weeks, in order to plan a local resistance event or campaign. Again, so these are going to be at the local level, distributed across the country. The ultimate goal is to use mass mobilization and strategic non-cooperation to weaken the pillars of support for the Trump administration. This is what they call an authoritarian regime. And they do that through undermining these pillars, which I'll go through on your screen here. This is an image from their training handbook. But they want to undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration and make, quote unquote, authoritarian action impossible, or at the very least, very difficult. So that first pillar there is business. So this could include things like boycotts or selective boycotts, enduring ones. Labor, so that's worker strikes, worker slowdowns. There's faith, so getting pastors of churches to come out and condemn the Trump administration, and also to encourage non-cooperation with these policies, especially on immigration enforcement. And there's education. Civil service is a big one, because they're actually encouraging federal employees who work under the Trump administration, encouraging them to grind the gears of these Trump policies. And then finally, military and police. And a big thing, you go back and you read Gene Sharp's book, which is essentially the Color Revolution manual. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. You go back and you read that. There's actually a whole section on how color revolutionaries, or how these organizers can actually approach and talk to military officers and police officers and encourage them not to go along with the quote unquote authoritarian regime, potentially defect, etc. But at least internally impose whatever their orders are. And so I think this is also very significant. When we talk about strategic non-cooperation, we're talking about action like internal resistance by federal workers. So losing paperwork, or effectively not doing your job, grinding the gears of federal operations down, refusing compliance with Trump administration policy. So there's a big thing in here about getting sheriff's offices, for instance, to not provide support to federal immigration enforcement. Information leaks is one of those things. So leaking sensitive information from the administration, which we have seen some of. Worker strikes and slowdowns. And then there are other forms of what's really nonviolent civil disobedience. That's exactly what we're talking about here. We're not talking about armed violence. We're not talking about even pitchforks and shovels. We're talking about nonviolent civil disobedience. So things like occupations and sit-ins and protests, other forms of nonviolent direct action. And all this is going to happen in addition to mass protests, which will continue. So between November 2024 and January 2025, and we covered this extensively at the time, these left-wing organizers started holding strategy sessions really to determine the best way to address the incoming Trump administration. And they settled on this concept of strategic non-cooperation, which is an old, Gandhi used nonviolent action like strategic non-cooperation against the British. So it's nothing new. But this is a resistance strategy that was chosen for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's relatively low risk. They're not asking anyone to engage in violence. You're not going to get a 20-year prison sentence for doing a sit-in or occupation. It also has much wider appeal. This will probably have mass appeal, or could have mass appeal at some point. So it's going to bring a lot of people into it. Giving someone a rifle or a bomb and telling them to go attack a target does not have mass appeal. But going out to protest or conduct nonviolent action is going to have much broader appeal. And then finally, this gives these organizers, this is by far the most important part, this gives these organizers runway to escalate from a mass protest organization or mass protest movement, which they've already built. We've had several protests of probably at least 3 million people. I think we've probably seen national days of protests with 3 million people. I don't know, maybe at least twice. But they have runway to escalate from the mass protest movement to a mass defiance movement, and then eventually or potentially to a mass revolutionary movement. And this is absolutely important because this is exactly what they're building here. It doesn't mean that they're going to press the big red button, but they've got the big red button on their desk, or they will. On that point, something that I've been talking about, even last year, October, November last year, I did a series of presentations on this. By the way, it would probably be beneficial for everyone for me to do another kind of Color Revolutions 101 presentation. If you're interested in that, let me know in the chat, and maybe we can schedule something. And I can update these presentations that are now 6+ months old. Just throw some more current information in here. But the reason why color revolutions are chosen and not armed revolutions or insurgencies or any other form of low-intensity conflict is because a color revolution, once it's launched in earnest, happens over weeks to months. These are not long, drawn-out things. They don't last years. Like an insurgency, they say the length of an average insurgency is something like 10 years. Nobody wants to do this for 10 years. They want to do it for weeks to months and come away with a win. So that's the big thing. And you go back, and again, you read Gene Sharp manual, and he says very explicitly, the reason why you embark on a nonviolent revolution, either a popular revolution or color revolution, is to topple an existing government in the shortest amount of time and with the least amount of human suffering. That is the humanitarian justification. And now how do they do that? Number one, they attack the pillars of government. On that last slide I showed you, they had business, labor, faith, civil service, etc. That's a little more tactical. We're going to go a little 30,000 foot view here. They want to undermine the legitimacy, authority, and capacity. This is at the strategic national level. Undermine these three things. These are the pillars of government. Legitimacy is the recognized right of a ruling or governing power to rule, to be in charge. There's a reason why no one thinks that, there's a reason why Trump is widely perceived as legitimate, because he was elected. So that's the first thing. They have to delegitimize President Trump and more broadly the Trump administration. How they do that is a tactical and operational decision, but these mass protests, strategic non-cooperation, will continue to at least extend their efforts to delegitimize the Trump administration. The second thing is they have to attack the pillar of authority. And one of the big things that we saw during the first Trump administration was this concept of being ungovernable. And that strikes at the heart of federal authority. If people don't obey the laws, then there is no authority. And so they're trying to reduce that authority because that further weakens the Trump administration, what they call the authoritarian regime. And then the third pillar of government is capacity. So they may be legitimate. A government may be legitimate. It may have authority, but if it can't enforce its authority, if it doesn't have the capacity, the manpower, the money, funding, the resources to enforce those laws, then they don't have the authority. And that also undermines their legitimacy. So these are the three pillars of government broadly that they have to attack. And again, by attack, they're doing this non-violently. That really is the kind of a key part of this. And then when we look at this, kind of this tug of war here, and that's exactly what this is. The the color revolutionaries, these left-wing organizers, they're trying to pull a mass of the population from some level of support, cooperation, acceptance, or neutrality into some level of opposition, non-cooperation, and defiance. So all citizens of a country fall somewhere on this spectrum, whether they support or oppose the government to varying degrees. The goal of this revolutionary movement is mass participation. It's mass mobilization. It is mass resistance. They've got to pull a bulk of the country into this, the red part of the spectrum, the revolutionary defiance part of the spectrum. So you see there that has three different things: opposition, non-cooperation, and defiance. They're trying to push now from just opposition, from relatively toothless, peaceful protests. They're trying to escalate now into non-cooperation. It's exactly what this is. So when I talk about how this strategy has runway to escalate, that's exactly what we're seeing. Mass protests, obviously, okay, didn't work. Protests don't work. Now they've got to get into non-cooperation and try to push people from selective resistance into mass resistance. And then if that doesn't work, then move into outright defiance and become a much larger problem. And then finally, if that doesn't work, or if they just get to the point where they need to, potentially press that big red button and try to launch an actual color revolution, a pro-democracy color revolution against the Trump administration or against whoever the president is, maybe in January 2029. Pretty open-ended, frankly. So this is where we are. We are still, I think, probably in the third or fourth inning. And it's going to be a long baseball game. But, it's another reason why, even last year, I've told y'all like a year ago, I said, guys, if Trump wins, there's not going to be another another summer of love in 2025 because they got to rebuild. They got to push more people into this red part of the spectrum. And they hadn't done that by November of last year. They hadn't done that by January of this year. They haven't done that by July of this year, but they're working on it. And so the worst is obviously ahead of us. I've been saying for a while, it's not going to be this year. Next year, maybe. Let's see how the midterms go. I tell you, this is actually a pretty good segue. If Texas actually does end up doing this mid-decade restructuring, I think that will significantly accelerate a lot of this non-cooperation to defiance movement, which is going to be the next, that's in the escalation ladder. That's the next rung. That's what we're looking at here. Probably next year. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on here to some questions. How are these protesters able to keep even the base level number of protests going? Surely they must have jobs or lives outside non-stop riots. Yeah, well, they do it because people are motivated to go out and protest. That's just a left-wing tactic. Protest, their favorite thing to do. So I think, first of all, it's kind of there's a lot of social conditioning that happens on the left and the right. But people on the left are socially conditioned. That's kind of the norm. And there's just a psychological desire to adhere to the norm in many cases, and that's protesting. So I think they've just been conditioned over decades to immediately resort to protest. So I think that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is people are just motivated. They think that there's power in numbers. They can send a signal to DC, or they can, you know what? It's not even about sending a signal to DC. It has been about sending a signal to their reps, their representatives in Congress. Because when their reps look at their city and they say, oh, 100,000 people showed up, that's a lot of voters. And one of the stated goals of these indivisible protest campaigns has been to send a message to Democrats and get them to do more. And when these Democrat members of Congress understand that they have a mass support of people back in their districts supporting them to be more aggressive, to take a harder line stance against the Trump administration, they're more likely to do that. So I think they see they see a lot of benefits in these mass protests. And then, of course, some of them are paid. They're just straight up paid. But I don't think pay is the largest issue. I think there's intrinsic motivation there. They're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. They think the protest is going to lead to more favorable outcome. Also, I just on a strategic level, there is the understanding that you have to mass protest, and that's basically a gauge. If you have a lot of people turning up to protests, then you have a much larger pool of people from which you can draw into civil disobedience or nonviolent direct action. You've also got to gauge the level of support. Do all these people who are turning out to protest, do they support escalation? And if you have a substantial 15, 25, 30% of this mass protest movement supporting escalation, then it's going to be sustainable. So I think that's also another factor to consider here. The escalation factor, which you got to start with protests. So there's maybe a few reasons. Regarding strategic non-cooperation, unrestricted warfare, well, those are two different things, but what do you see as a reaction to this? How will the administration counter it, or will other citizens rise up against them? Well, there's a huge risk of the Trump administration doing too much to oppose these groups. And one of the things that we have seen is actually a desire to trigger a Trump administration response. It basically any insurgency on earth, at least in the past 50 years, that's been basically insurgents wake up every day and they say, oh, how can we bait the occupation force? How can we bait the opponent, the counterinsurgent, into overreacting, into killing people, injuring people, doing something that the public would not agree with? And that's how the insurgent builds support for his cause. They say, yeah, we're insurgents. Yeah, of course we're violent. But we're being violent because these people are fascists or because the government is oppressive. And if you don't want to live under their oppression anymore, then you support us, or at least don't oppose us. And when you get, there's I think a misconception. Popular support is absolutely important. These movements, whether it's a protest movement, direct action movement, nonviolent, or insurgent movement, revolutionary movement, you do have to have the support of the people. But there is an asterisk there. You don't need popular support as long as you have acquiescence. And when people acquiesce to you, they may not actively support you, may not even passively support you. But if you can just gain their acquiescence, if you can just have them say, you know what, I'm not going to interfere with what you do, while also opposing the government, that's pretty much as good as popular support in many cases. So that's, I think probably some percentage of Americans probably fall into that category. And, I don't have polling data. That's just kind of a gut expectation here. As far as other citizens rising up against these, we have not seen many, I can't recall. I'm sure there have been counter protests or counter demonstrations, but not like we saw from 2016, 17 in, that era. Will that happen? It could. I don't expect that to be the main course of action. What we know works, and we know this from Columbia, and we know this from the campus occupations, the pro-Palestine campus occupations that we've seen over the past couple of years. What works is arresting people who break the law, charging them, and putting them in jail if they're found guilty. And then if you can find conspiracy, slapping RICO charges on them or conducting a RICO investigation. That works. That's probably what the DOJ needs to stick to. And otherwise, if they're not violating the law. See, here's the thing about power. Okay, so there's power and there's the illusion of power. Mass protests can give the illusion of power. You say, oh, we had 3 million people turn out for our protests last weekend. The exercise of power results in submission. You're forcing someone else to submit to your will. If you're exercising power and you're not causing anyone to submit to your will, you don't have actual power. You have the illusion of power. It's like you're on a stationary bicycle and you're pedaling. And yeah, you're exercising, but you're not going anywhere. That's the illusion of cycling. So the question is, for these movements, what does real power look like? And real power is going to look like forcing the other side to submit. And these protests have not forced anyone to submit. Maybe they have encouraged Democrats at some level. Maybe they have encouraged some Republicans to not be as brazen in their support for Trump if they're in a district where maybe they win by a point or two. Maybe they don't want to anger those constituents. So maybe that is having some limited power. But it has not been politically significant yet, I don't think. But they're trying to get there. All right, let's move on. Are conservatives and Democrats just going to go back and forth with this strategic non-cooperation against the administration in power? Strategic non-cooperation is just not a conservative or right-wing tactic. Someone said that, I don't even remember who said this, but they said it and it's absolutely true. The right views conflict or violence as a switch. It's either on or it's off. There's no halfway on. It's on, it's off. The left views violence and conflict as a dial. It can be turned up, it can be turned back down. Turned up, So in terms of what happens with conservative opposition or conservative dissidents versus a left-wing president and vice versa, it depends. Anytime we talk about conflict, we're talking about three things. So first of all, fault lines. This political divide, the ideological divide, is absolutely a fault line. And really it's not. For a long time, it was political and ideological and economic because you had class conflict. Okay, the haves versus the have-nots. But increasingly, since the Obama administration, certainly, we've got this larger religious divide. That's a fault line. We've got a much larger racial or ethnic divide. That's a fault line. Matt Bracken talks about the rural-urban divide. So there's just a lot of division in this country. And what happens is when you have those fault lines rub against each other, you get tremors. Those are the tectonic plates of society shifting rubbing against each other. And that causes friction. That causes problems, causes civil unrest. If that continues to happen, then if that continues to happen, now we call that acceleration. This is acceleration of conflict. So that could be media coverage. I saw someone ask about, does the media play a role or something to that effect? Of course they do. Of course, the media exists to agitate. And we saw years and years of worth of agitation from 2015 to 2020. And so, yes, the media obviously plays a massive role. Remember, the media exists to condition. A lot of people think the news is there to inform, and that's partially true. But really, the news is marketing and marketing is conditioning. They're trying to condition beliefs. Influence is the power of getting someone to adopt a belief. And so, yes, the media plays an absolutely vital role. I wouldn't necessarily say a color revolution is dependent on cooperative media, but it sure helps. You have to have some agitator. And maybe that's not traditional media. Maybe that's social media. Maybe that's something local. I would say it's important, but probably not critical. All right, let's go back to the three things here. So you got fault lines, you got accelerators of conflict, and then you got trigger events. Jared, can you go back to that last question, please? And then you've got trigger events. So this is like Lexington and Concord, Fort Sumter, MLK assassination, George Floyd. You have this event that is so incendiary, either literally or figuratively, because part of this acceleration phase, you're building pressure up inside a system. One reason why I didn't think 2025 was going to pop off into Summer of Love 2.0, because there was not enough pressure built up. We didn't have years and years worth of agitation and pressure and acceleration of conflict in 2025. But that's being built. And so once you have enough pressure inside the system, then you are primed for a trigger event. And whatever that trigger event's going to be, I don't know. Obviously not predictable. But when you get that trigger event, that's when you have that revolutionary rupture. That's when you have that pressure inside the system that's just built up, like you just put air into a balloon, and it can only take so much, and eventually it pops. So that is that's the left strategy, to push us into another trigger moment. And I think that's more likely than not probably going to come in 2028, not 25 or 26. I don't think you can do something like this prematurely unless we see the Trump administration just do something so egregious that that period of acceleration is accelerated, it's condensed, because you have a lot of pressure built up in the system. I don't think that's going to happen before 2028. It could. That's also why we do what we do every single day, to tell you how close we are to this event. And I just don't think we're close now. All right. Next question, Jared. Yes, on Color Revolution 10. Okay, listen, give me a couple weeks. I'm going to get something scheduled, and we'll do this for Forward Observer subscribers. We'll do a presentation and do a nice Q&A session for everyone. I want everyone to understand this, because this is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, literally, like week to week, we're seeing these indicators that this machine is being built. Maybe we'll do something for mid-August. How much of this is fifth-gen warfare? Trump is fascist on the left, claims of deep state corruption on the right, pushing each base towards losing overall trust in government. You know, Rick, I think that's a really good point. If you want to call it fifth-generation warfare, you want to call it PSYOP, you want to call it whatever, the inform and influence, propaganda, whatever. I think that's a very fair observation, that what it's actually doing is it is eroding trust, probably not just against each other, but probably in the whole system, which is obviously concerning. How much of this is fifth-gen warfare? You know, I don't know. I couldn't say, but obviously it is narrative driven. It's ideology driven. At some point, there probably is some foreign influence, we know, I'm not sure it's been politically significant, but we know there has been foreign information. I mean, we're always subjected to foreign information operations. But the thing is, it's not even a country as it's a country as a whole. It is the target audience. You have a foreign power. The foreign power doesn't say, "Oh, we're gonna try to influence every American." No, they're going to look for a group or subgroup. They're a particular type of people. It's called their target audience. And they say, these are the channels we're going to use. This is the message we are going to use. And this is what we want them to do. Or maybe they work backwards. They say, this is what we want them to do. This is the message we need to give them. And then this is the channel that we're going to push this message through. So that part of fifth-gen warfare is certainly happening. Hey, listen, everyone, we certainly appreciate your support. Thanks for being here and watching us. If this is your first time here, we do this Monday through Friday. We try to give the best, most comprehensive intelligence brief available without a top secret security clearance. We're all former intel guys, and we do this because Americans just need to understand what's going on. And by and large, you're definitely not getting the full picture. And in many cases, you're not getting any significant part of the picture either from other sources. That's why we exist here at Forward Observer, to reduce uncertainty about the future. And once we understand what the future looks like, we can be prepared for it. That's our whole mission here at Forward Observer, is to get people prepared for the future through understanding first. So we appreciate you watching. If you've been around for a while, I highly encourage you, go to forwardobserver.com. That's our website. Go sign up, free 7-day trial, get access to everything we do behind the paywall. And I will schedule this. We'll do this for mid-August. We're going to do another kind of Color Revolution update. And maybe I just make this a monthly thing. Try to gauge how close we are. I'll tell you exactly what I'm seeing build and talk about what's next so that you can anticipate what's next. Because listen, this is like baking a cake. Okay. We know what the ingredients looks like. We generally know how they need to be mixed. We generally know how long it's going to take to bake it. But I can't tell you exactly what minute it's going to come out of the oven. But if we do something like this each month, kind of like a Color Revolution monthly update, it's like turning the light on in the oven. We're going to be able to see how close we are. So with that, everyone, thanks again for your support. Go be a Forward Observer subscriber, Forward Observer member. Support our mission here, and we will continue to do our absolute best to keep you aware of what's going on around the world and at home. Talk about the things that matter, that affect you in the future. And with that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. Again, we'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.